So if there is one thing that I hope you take away from our discussion today, it is this. Generative media lets us do some amazing stuff. It empowers people to make creations that we never could have created before. And we are going to play around with how to do some of that. But, and it is a big but, there are serious ethical questions behind generative media. So it is up to us, as we are using this technology, to make sure we respect those ethics and that we behave in ethical ways when doing so. Hey everyone, my name's Alan Firstenberg. I'm a software developer and consultant. I work for a small consulting company called Objective Consulting, located in, well, we're located all over. How many of you are RPI students? A couple of you. Okay, so I was an RPI student once myself. I graduated in 1992, which seems like ages ago at this point. It's been a very long time since I stood at the front of CC308. So it is an honor to be here. I'm a Google developer expert, which means that I don't work for Google, but I work very closely with Google to help them understand what it is that we as developers need. And at the same time, I help us, developers. I'm a developer myself. I help other developers understand what it is that Google can do for us. What are the tools that Google is bringing to the table that enable us to do things better, faster, cheaper, or do things that we never could have done before? I'm also a LangChain.js champion. How many of you are familiar with LangChain or LangChain.js? Kind of half-hearted, okay. So again, it means I don't work for the LangChain company, but I contribute to their open source product. Now, we heard earlier the comment about how if you want to get involved in an open source product. Well, that's exactly what I did 2 years ago. I had heard about this great product called LangChain. I saw that they had a JavaScript version. I like JavaScript more than I like Python, so I started playing with it a little bit more. But as I dug into it, I discovered that it didn't support Google's AI products at the time. So I contributed a little. And then I contributed a little bit more. And then a little bit more. And then I started talking to some of their engineers about where they were going, and I contributed a little bit more to the overall product. Currently, I'm the #3 contributor to LangChain.js on GitHub. And that's the #1 contributor behind two LangChain people that work for the company. So I've contributed nearly all of the code behind running Gemini inside LangChain. And all of that got started because I found an area of interest, I found an area of need, and I started doing what I could. And then it ballooned from there. I'm also the co-host of a podcast called Two Voice Devs, and what we cover these days, we've been around for 5 years now, what we cover mostly is the developing AI environment as it pertains to developers. What does it mean for developers to use AI? What does it mean for developers to use AI in what we make? And how we bring it to our customers? And what are the tools that we are using to, again, do things better, faster, cheaper? We talk about that pretty much every week at this point. The company I work for is at spiders.com. You can find all of my material, including these slides, at prisoner.com. So if you've got anything that you want to come back and reference later, prisoner.com is where to find it. I'll have a QR code at the end. So what are we talking about today? We're going to be talking about Gen Media. And it's a incredibly broad term. I'm not going to try to define it too much. How many of you have heard of Nano Banana? 1, 2, okay, a couple of you. How many of you have heard of VO? A few more, okay. So Nano Banana and VO are two models that Google has created that help turn text into images or movies, or in some cases turning still images and modifying those images or taking a still image and turning it into a movie, or various other things like that. So when I talk about gen media, I'm going to be talking about using multimedia, using images mostly. Mostly today we're going to be talking about images, although the same concepts I think apply to audio and to other similar issues. And specifically we're going to be looking at and playing with in a little bit these two models and see how we can play with it in what I think are ethical and good ways. And I think that's kind of where I want to start, because I think that's pretty important, is saying what are the ethics of generative media? And pretty much you'll see people dividing into two different camps. You'll see people that are opposed to having AI models working with these images and audio and others. But the biggest reason, and an entirely valid reason, is that these models were trained somewhat on images that are in the public domain, pictures and such that have been around for over 100 years, but much of their training material has been on very modern media. And the artists that created that media were not compensated for it. So they see generative media as outright theft. Their creations were used in ways without their permission and without any compensation to them. And when you are generating some media, if you say things like generate this in the style of Studio Ghibli, well, now you've got a whole assortment of images that look very much like they could have been created by that studio, but were not. So things look too close to the original. There have been some experiments with generative media where people have said, described a particular painting, described a particular image, and what was generated was nearly identical to the original painting, including the signature of the artist. That, I think we might all pretty much agree, is pretty darn close to intellectual property theft. And I think we can all pretty much agree that's wrong. That is an unethical use of this. On the other side of this debate are, not surprisingly, the tech companies and the researchers who have built this sort of thing. Now, what they're saying is that, look, we collected all of this media under copyright fair use. We were doing it for research and educational purposes, and these are perfectly permitted reasons to look at media. And that's how they're kind of portraying it. They didn't steal it. Just like we would go look at a piece of art, and looking at that piece of art has now shaped how we might produce art. They're saying, we've trained our models to look at these images, and now that it has influenced how it is doing so. And there's some merit to that. They would also point out that the tools that they're creating are meant to be used by artists. Artists can take these tools and enhance their own artwork in ways that were difficult to do before. And then finally they say, look, it's not our fault, it's the users. The people who are using our tools are using them inappropriately. So we didn't do anything wrong, it's them. I kind of agree with both sides on this, to be perfectly honest. So where do I stand? I have kind of a more reasoned approach to this. I do look at gen media and say, there are ways that it is responsible that we can use it. And we should only try to use it in those responsible ways. But absolutely, if we have gone beyond purely educational reasons, if we have gone beyond just training these models to understand what they are looking at and seeing, and instead can now generate what they have seen, then artists need to be compensated for that. And by compensated, I don't mean we're now giving them tools that they can pay us to use. I mean real compensation. So kind of how do I think about this? And this is I want to make this a conversation. So if you've got feedback, if you have thoughts on this, we have a microphone here that we can pass around, or you can feel free to come up and use it. But from here on out, I want this to be a conversation, especially when we start generating some of this media ourselves. We're going to have these long gaps where we're waiting for it to do something, and that might be a good time to express your thoughts or perspectives. So my thoughts on how we should be using it. So the first part is, if we're just using it for image understanding and not for generation, that's appropriate to me. Because that is saying what a human would do is we would look at it and we now have a better understanding of the art that we're looking at. Or if we look at a picture and we can say, yes, I see that picture has a camera in it, or it has this other type of object in it. I think both of, this is an appropriate use for this technology, is to be able to train it on a whole bunch of pictures of stuff, and then later when we show it a new picture, it can identify, oh, here are the objects that I see in this picture, here is where they are in the picture, and so forth. We need training material for that. That's a reasonable use that does not explicitly violate the artist's intentions. Similar to that, how many of you are familiar with the concept of embeddings, vector embeddings? So I think it's also appropriate to say, okay, if we train it on use this to train our models with a number of pictures to create embeddings, so that later when we introduce other photos, those can also be embedded in similar ways. Again, we're not trying to generate something new. We're not trying to take the artist's work and create something different out of it. We're using the artist's work to help understand the world around us. And I think an artist would kind of agree that that's an acceptable goal. At least I see it that way. One of the other things that I think is really core to an ethical use of this is that gen media should never misrepresent reality. So the whole notion of a deep fake, totally unethical in my mind. Are we trying to deceive somebody with what we are showing them? If the answer is yes, it is unethical, clearly unethical. If the answer is no, we're not out to deceive. We may be trying to tell a story. We may be clearly trying to do something that is fictional. That's acceptable. That's okay. But we need to make it clear that what it is that we are showing is not reality. That we have generated this through gen media, through a model in some way. And some other thoughts about how we can do this are to say, well, why don't we just use an illustrated picture instead of something that's photorealistic? So if we say, draw this as an illustration, draw this as line art, draw this in a black and white pencil sketch, it's clearly not real. Nobody's going to even think that it is real. Whereas if we're saying, make this photorealistic, make this look as much like reality as we can, there we're trying to confuse, we're deliberately trying to confuse people. Now, I think there are some kind of edge cases on this. If I have a photo of something, and it's a deliberate photo that I've taken, and I want to change the color of the person's shirt, or remove a watch that they weren't supposed to be wearing, or put a hat on them with their consent, that's okay. Edits, touch-ups, those are fine. How many of you are familiar with Google's Magic Eraser tool in Google Photos? Fantastic tool, I love the tool. It lets you remove people from the background, or remove overhead wires, or remove stuff that is there, but kind of messes up the photo a little bit. I don't see that as misrepresenting reality. It's more like trying to take a reality that is there and represent it in a way that you have in your mind. Now, you can argue with that. There are certainly some changes that go over the line. If you put me in a plaid shirt, I would object to be putting in a plaid shirt. If you were taking a photo of me and had modified me to represent me in some way, that might be over the line, even though you might think that it's just a touch-up. The other kind of place where I think it's appropriate is in environments where we're already expecting special effects. So if we are using generative AI as part of editing a bigger movie, and I wanted to create an explosion that looks bigger than or even make an explosion where none was, nobody is going to go to a fictional movie and expect it to look exactly like reality. So it's okay to use it in these places where we don't have an expectation of reality. The other kind of cornerstone that I try to abide by when I'm using it is to use my own content. And the best way to do that is if I'm starting from pictures that I took myself. If I took it myself, if it is my own artwork that I am starting with, then I can do whatever I want with that artwork, however I choose to do it, as long as it is clearly mine. So most of the work that I tend to do is I will have taken a photo of something. I've been an amateur photographer for decades, so I have lots of photos, and I will take one and modify it, or take two and merge them together, or something along those lines. The other thing that I might do, for example, is take a photo and ask Gemini to describe that photo to me, and then based on that description, turn it into an illustrated piece of artwork. So starting from a textual description, turn that into some artwork, and I might enhance that to do other stuff. So very often when I'm building my podcasts, I will frequently take, standard descriptions of my co-host, have the two of us sitting down in front of microphones. Now mind you, we're hundreds of miles apart. We're not sitting on the same stage together with microphones in front of us. And then have the background something that represents the topic of what we're talking about. So if we're talking about MCP, I might have a bunch of robots walking around in the background with boxes, okay? Now clearly none of that is real. It's all illustrated, so I'm not trying to pretend that it's real. But it's all inspired by me. I think the other notion on this, be inspired, not a copycat, is that I think saying something like, take this picture of me and turn me into Superman. That's an unethical borderline in my mind, because we're now saying take me and put me in place of somebody else's intellectual property. On the other hand, if I said something like, take this picture of me and turn me into a superhero wearing spandex and a cape, okay, that's saying, take this existing image of me and not using any specific IP, but putting me into a broader genre. That, to me, feels acceptable, because it now is requiring me to go in and create my own inspirations. Because when I see whatever it comes up with, I could say, yeah, I don't like those colors. Why don't you make it, blue and light blue, because I like blues. Why don't you make these other changes? So use your own inspiration. Don't feel like you need to copy somebody else's. And that's one of the great things about Gen Media, is that it lets us tap into our own inspirations, our own desires. So again, here's the QR code to my site in general, and this deck is underneath it. We're going to switch in a moment and start playing around and generating our own models, or generating our own images based on some stuff. So we'll be looking at how Nano Banana works, and then looking at how VO works. All right. So to start with, we will, how well can you see that? Not well. Let's try it a little bigger. So we are using AI Studio. How many of you are familiar with Google's AI Studio? Okay. So if you go to aistudio.google.com, there are a number of things that you can do there. This is basically their playground for using the Gemini model, a variety of other models that they have, including the version of Gemini that works with Nano Banana. So we have selected that now. And like I said, I like to start with my own, with images that I have. So let's go pull up this headshot of me. And let's modify this a little bit. Let's say, let's add a blue top hat. Because if we're going to go absurd, we might as well go really absurd. And again, while it's doing so were there any questions or thoughts about what we've said so far about the ethics behind this? Okay, so we have a couple here. Why don't I?
Hi.
Hi.
My name's Samar. I'm here a student at RPI. And I was wondering, when you brought up the Superman example, and you mentioned IP and IP theft, if you were to say, present myself as Superman, and that image that would be generated would be basically unethical because of the IP issues. But say you said, if I said a general superhero, and then it generates you in just a leotard, but say that leotard is blue and the cape is red, and there just happens to be an S on the front of your image. Would that image now become unethical just because of the way the model is generated?
That's a great question. And the answer I would say is yes. And the reason why is because I guess the kind of way I think about it is that you are not absolved of responsibility of what gets created. You are the artist now. So it is up to you as the artist to make sure that what you are using this tool for remains ethical. Now, if that's what it created, then you could say, well, change the colors, change the letter on the, we could debate and quibble exactly where that line is. If I change it to, if I keep it as red and blue with the letter Q, is it still ethical? If I left the letter S but changed it to green and yellow, is it still ethical? I don't know the answers to those. But what I guess what I do feel is that whatever gets created, you as the artist is responsible for. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Just a follow-up question.
Can you just speak up a little louder?
Sorry. Just a follow-up question to that. So if the burden of basically ethical usage of AI is placed on us, in your personal view, how would we go about regulating AI? Like, can we say it's wrong to deepfake? We know that this is wrong, so should we place limitations on models? Should we say any face alteration should be banned? Like, you cannot change anything on somebody's face, whether it be even a hair on their head. Like, all requests of that should be denied. Do you personally believe in regulating models in this way?
So you asked two slightly different questions there. The first is, should models be regulated? And note that I kept to the term ethical very carefully. I didn't say legal. And there's a reason I kept to that divide. And it's because ethics are a personal thing. We may have industries that establish codes of ethics, but those codes of ethics are imposed on a person. Now, one could argue that once you have established an ethical basis, shouldn't it also be a legal basis? Or once we have an ethical basis, should the companies enforce that ethical basis? And I don't think that's necessarily a bad idea. On the other hand, I don't want to make that step. I want to say, I guess kind of where I'm going with this is, I want to highlight the fact that we ourselves, as the people using it, have a personal responsibility here. Now, I think the companies may implement tools to assist with that. I think the companies certainly have a burden to reduce the likelihood of unethical use, but they can't eliminate it. And I kind of worry about trying to pass laws that force them to do so. That, and I also don't think they're going to do it well. We have tried to fight copyright violations on YouTube since the day it launched, and we've had very poor success at that. I don't see it getting any better with better AI tools. So I more want to make sure that the people who are using these tools are doing so responsibly and according to their own personal ethics. Was that was
Yeah.
one? Was it? I already forgot what the other one was. I said there were two, and I forgot what the other one was.
I think, well, in my mind, those questions were linked, but I appreciated the distinction between ethical and like legal.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, like we all obviously have our own ethical responsibilities while we're using AI and even just operating as developers in general. But I think I was more interested in whether or not like there even could be a legal aspect to it, just because of the way that I think more famously Meta came under fire for Instagram and just like that whole, and in my mind, like AI is even worse, or
Yes.
it's just there are infinitely many possibilities just with that. So
I mean, I would like to believe that yes, we should have a legal framework around these ethics.
Right.
But again, I don't think it can be done. I don't think it's enforceable. I'm a little more of a pragmatist when it comes to that, I guess. So I did see there was another question. Let's do this a little bit more. Thank you. Well, let me do this a little bit more. We'll have another pause when it generates another image. So, okay. So that's not a bad top hat, but but it's a top hat lighter. Because, my color blue is a lighter blue. And we're going to go somewhere with this, don't worry. Oh, that's perfect. Now, so now let's... So now let's make me walk through the park wearing this top hat and carrying a walking stick. And while it's doing that, what's your question or your thoughts?
Okay, it works.
you're good.
Sorry, I had to turn the mic off just in case it was on. Should I let you finish this?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So I'm Purva Vakaria. I'm a freshman from Stevens Institute of Technology. And my question was, what is your take on generating propaganda through Google AI?
Generating propaganda through
because
Google
it's
AI?
It kind of falls into a lot of categories that you described as ethical and not ethical. So it's like a weird combination of whether it's a good thing or it shouldn't be allowed. So what do you think? Should it be allowed or not?
Okay, so propaganda is a loaded word for starters, and currently it has a negative connotation to it. As such, I would say that propaganda is automatically unethical. However, I think your broader question kind of goes to, can we use generative media to help it represent our point of view on something? And there, I think it starts getting into questions, it gets into, are these deep fakes? Are we trying to represent something that isn't reality? Are we trying to represent something, and maybe reality is not quite the right word in this case, are we trying to represent our perspective of reality that somebody else might say is not their perspective of reality? And that's a good question. I would lean against it at this point. Mostly right now, because almost any propaganda or any trying to get my message out along those lines involves somebody else, a picture of somebody else or a picture of something else. And while it may be ethical to use a picture of a public figure, because they are a public figure, in that sort of a way, I think that once you start manipulating the picture of a public figure, you're crossing over an ethical line. And that's a personal opinion.
And I guess another question going off of what you said that I thought of when you said public figure, some artists don't show their face. Do you think that like using like generating potential images of what they look like would be a ethical issue or not?
That's an interesting question, because now you're starting asking questions like, is their image part of their artwork? Is their image part of their brand? And again, I would start turning into, are you trying to represent something that is not reality? You know, if you're talking Banksy in particular, right?
Boy with Uke is an example, but obviously he showed his face
Okay.
at some point. But
You know,
yeah.
so if I'm trying to,
Or Marshmallow.
you know, if I am trying to portray an image of Banksy creating some of his artwork, you know, we don't know what they look like.
Right.
So would an AI-generated image of that be ethical? That's an interesting question. I don't know, I'd have to think about that one a little bit more. I think my gut feeling is no, it wouldn't be, unless you did something like not show their face. You know, if you're showing just a generic person, maybe a generic person in jeans and a hoodie, from the back, creating this artwork, that might be ethical in my mind, because you're not trying to say, this is what this person looks like. You're trying to say, there is a person that created this art, but we don't know what they look like. So you're respecting the fact that they're trying to remain anonymous, while at the same time trying to acknowledge their work and acknowledge that there is a person there. Mm-hmm. That is a very off-the-cuff where I might draw that line. And I don't know. Let's get back to this. Again, we can come back to more questions. So that's not a bad picture of me walking through the park carrying a walking stick and a top hat. I like that. So you know what? Let me download that. And let's create some videos with it. So we'll call that one Alan Top Hat. Make sure I spelled that right. OK. So now I'm going to jump over to a Unix command line. And I'm doing this because right now, VO3, or VO3.1, the latest version of VO, is only available if you write your own programs. It's not available in AI Studio directly. So I've written a program to do this. And it is a complicated, ugly-looking command line thing, but tough. I do this because I'm a developer, and I like getting down and dirty with some of the stuff that I'm playing with here. VO2 is still available through AI Studio, but don't bother. Okay. VO2 is truly terrible. VO3 is only bad. VO2 is terrible. So let's, this was Alan Top Hat. Okay, and we'll give it a prompt. So we're going to say the first frame of this movie that we're creating will be named is the Alan Top Hat photo that we just downloaded. We're going to do it as a portrait because the image that we downloaded is in portrait format. Some other technical stuff, we're going to be saving this as part of Google Cloud Platform, and we're giving it a prompt. The man walks through a park, cheerful and happy. So it's now copying files, running the model. We have time for another question. Trust me, we have time on this one. It's going to be an 8-second video that it's going to create, and it's going to take well more than 8 seconds to create it. We have a hand up front.
Hello. Oh, hi.
Hi.
Did you get a chance to take a look at Sora?
So I looked at the original Sora, and I was actually pretty impressed by the original Sora. The original Sora was much, much better than the original VO. They did some things that were very nice. Yeah? Oh, Sora is basically OpenAI's video generation model. Oh, okay. It's OpenAI's equivalent of VO, and they did it first, to give them credit. Google released VO not too long afterwards, which was terrible. Have made several improvements since. VO 3.1, VO's most recent one, was released before Sora 2. I've not played a lot with Sora 2. My biggest issues with Sora 2 kind of go to what we were talking about in the ethics before, is that they are playing extremely fast and loose with intellectual property. And the quality is not significantly better than VO3. So here's me walking like a dandy through a park. So it generated 2 videos. Let's see what the second one looked like. Pretty similar, actually. But it's pretty impressive. You know, from that one still shot, it's getting a couple of good sides of me. It's getting my motion pretty well. We've got this walking stick that's walking down, so it looks pretty good. To finish answering your question, the quality is about the same as VO3.1 from what I've seen. I think both of them still have serious world understanding problems. And what I mean by world understanding is that you can give it prompts and it doesn't really quite understand what you're asking it to do. You know, OpenAI has presented a lot of really good examples that look really, really good, and Google has presented a lot of really good examples that look really, really good. And this one came out really, really well. Yep. But I've equally done a number of them where, you know, maybe if I get a chance, I will find and show a video where I have a tentacle coming up out of a bowl of soup, grabbing a spoon, and dragging it back into the bowl of soup. That seems like it should be really easy to do. I have hundreds of videos where it does not do that. And I don't know why it has a particular problem with this bowl of soup, this tentacle, and this spoon. And you know, again, that seems like a fairly real-world understanding type thing that shouldn't be too difficult to do in a world model, and yet it is. Sora has its own equivalent issues of it just doesn't seem to understand the world that it's supposed to be running in.
In terms of image generation and video generation, where do you think we're
I'm sorry, repeat that a little bit louder.
In terms of image generation and video generation, where do you think we are headed with all these videos getting generated? Like, how are we expected to be watching these videos that are like literally AI slops being referred as? Like, how do you think it's going to shape in near future?
So one of the things that I think is interesting about all of this generative media is that, and in fact, all generative text as well, is that a lot of people are saying things like, now you'll be able to create something and the world will watch it. You'll be able to generate money based on this. And I'm like, why? Why would I want to watch your creation of a superhero when I can watch my creation of a superhero? If I am fully empowered to create my own stories and watch them come to life, why would I care about yours? And you need to answer, the person creating it needs to answer that question before you answer any other question. Why is the story that I'm trying to tell going to be better than the story you can tell yourself? Did that answer that question, or did it dodge it a little bit? I think it dodged it a little bit, but I think that's the kind of underlying question when it comes to everything that's coming out in Gen Media now is, why should I care about your version of this? Okay, so this is pretty good, but you know what? Let's go a little bit more absurd, actually. So now I want to dump a bucket of blue paint on top of this person while they are walking. Because again, that's the story that I'm trying to tell right now at this moment, and for some reason, you're interested in seeing it. Okay, so remember I said, you know, we've got some issues with world building here? I think that kind of illustrates it, because yes, it follows the instructions correctly. It is dumping a bucket of blue paint on top of me, but the blue paint is kind of suspended in midair. So it's fulfilling the prompt, but it's not really understanding the world that it lives in. Nevertheless, let's try this. Let's save this. And we're going to save this as Alan Top Hat Paint. And now if we go over to VO, let's tell VO, well, the first frame is that. Let's also give it the last frame. Because that's one of the neat things that VO lets you do, and I don't think actually Sora lets you do that yet, although it may. So going back to the comparison between the two, what I've seen is that VO is offering, at least to developers, and I'm not even sure Sora is available to developers yet, to be honest. Did they launch? Right, they launched the app. I'm not sure if they launched access to the model to developers or not. I knew they said they were going to, I just couldn't remember if they had or not yet. VO launched their app and launched access on day one, which is pretty impressive, to be honest, because that's a lot of CPU cycles going into it. Where was I going with it? Oh, so one of the things is they give a lot more features. So you can specify first frame, you can specify last frame, you can specify aspect ratio. A new feature that was literally just released is that you can give it a video and say, extend this by 8 seconds, and then extend that by 8 seconds, and then extend that by 8 seconds. And they say it works well for about a minute, and then after that it starts getting a little weird. So, a normal video is 8 seconds at a time. If you keep extending that by 8 seconds, you can now get a minute of a pretty good video. And if you are a commercial producer, if you're producing commercials, it's great. I can now say, put this Coke bottle into this scene, or take this Coke bottle. Let's see what happens to me. He's walking, come on. Ooh, that's not good. What about this one? Okay. So we have 2 attempts that did not do what I told it to do. And I did specify the first, no, I had a typo. See, this is what happens when you write your own software. It's easy to ignore your own bugs, and you don't put in safeguards. So let's try that again. So one of the great uses of this, for example, and I think this is a very ethical use of it, going back to our original conversation, is, for example, if I am a company that's hired to advertise Coca-Cola, and I can now take a picture of a Coke bottle on a plain old, just by itself, put it into a scene where I want it. So put it on the background of a restaurant or on the, a kitchen counter or whatever. Maybe even take another picture of that kitchen counter or restaurant and tell Nano Banana to merge the two. And then say, have a hand reach in, take the bottle out of the frame and put it back in empty. Okay, I've now created an 8-second commercial of a number of elements, all of which I had control over. And I'm doing it in a responsible way. Now, you could also say, look, why didn't you just take a picture of the hand moving in and out like that? That's reasonable. But you can also see the idea of how to extend that, how to take this concept to do things that you couldn't necessarily do in the real world. Again, you're not trying to misrepresent reality, but you're trying to show an alternate version of reality with components that you own. That make sense? I think that's probably one of the most exciting, or one of the most interesting parts of this that I see are how advertisers are going to use this kind of thing. Okay, he stopped, and a bucket of paint falls on him. That's real, but once again, I want to show that one again. So watch the bucket of paint at the end, however. Okay? Now, as he turns his head, the bucket is following it. So again, we're seeing it did really well, but then it broke its world understanding, because that doesn't make any sense. So these models are far from perfect at this point. Let's see what the other video generated looks like.
Okay, that one's even worse. But you kind of get the idea of how these tools can be used and what they're good for, and I hope how we can do so ethically. So again, my name's Alan Firstenberg. That link will also take you to a place where you can connect with me on LinkedIn, and I encourage you to do so. I'd love to continue this conversation here, offline, elsewhere. I'll be around for the rest of the day. Thank you all so very much for taking part in this.